Well, I'm delighted to welcome Alexander Kolesnikov to give our workshop today. Alexander spoke at our conference in person last year in 2021 on declination, and he gave a fantastic talk. I mean, Alexander lives in Bulgaria, and as you probably know, last year travel in and out of the UK was pretty difficult because of various COVID restrictions and so on. So it was a Herculean effort for him to get here, and we're very grateful that he did. We got fantastic feedback on his talk then, so we're delighted to welcome him back today to give this workshop on declinations. Alexander's an author. He's had 11 books published in Russian, and he's also an app developer, and he does have a website in English, which he will be talking about in the course of this talk. So let us please welcome Alexander Kolesnikov. Thank you very much. Over to you, Alexander.
Mercury is retrograde. So I would like to start from a question. Which of astrological aspects do you think is the most important, the most powerful, the most potent? The answer is obvious. It's conjunction, right? Because this is what we were taught in astrology schools. This is what's written in astrology books. This is what we know from our practice. Its conjunction is the king of aspects. And yet there were astrologers who would disagree with us. For example, a rather well-known astrologer of the 19th century, Zadkiel, wrote in his The Grammar of Astrology book that the zodiacal parallel is of more importance than any other aspect. The effect of this position is exactly the same as that of a close conjunction, but more powerful. Interesting. There is something more powerful, according to Zadkiel, than a conjunction. And there is another astrologer, Bishop Culpeper, who wrote in the very end of the 19th century that the most powerful aspect of all is the parallel of declination. Then come the conjunction and opposition, almost equal to the parallel, but not quite. Again, there's something more important than a conjunction or an opposition. Interesting. And then here's the opinion of a very well-known American astrologer, Charles Jane, who is well known as a technical astrologer and a very thorough astrologer, I would say. And this is what he wrote in his book, Parallels, the Hidden Meaning, published in 1978. Some charts cannot be interpreted in their main thrust if declination is omitted. So what Charles Jane tells us is that without declination and its aspects, we might miss something very important in an astrological chart. And here's our contemporary, John Wilner, who wrote in The Powerful Declinations in 2014. My experience has been that no horoscope is complete without declinations, and an astrologer would miss better than half of all aspects in natal and progress charts if they were not included. They provide an enormous amount of information. Looks like without declination and the aspects of declination, we are probably missing something in our astrology. And yet, in the contemporary astrology, there are many people who have no idea what declination is, never heard of it. And they keep working quite successfully in astrology. And there are also people who know about declination, but think that this is something, some technical sophistication. They don't really need it. So my aim today is first to tell what declination is to those who don't know that. And the second aim is to show that it's very easy. There's nothing complex about it. And the third aim is to show that there are many cases in astrology when without the declination, sometimes we're missing a lot in our understanding. So let's begin. So what is declination? At this point, many authors of astrological articles and books start showing complex astronomical diagrams. And those people in the audience who are not very technical, they just switch off and, oh, no. that's not for me. I can live without that, definitely. I don't want to go into that math, into those details. It's frightening. So there is no need to do that. I believe there are two ways to explain what declination is. One way is simple. It's sufficient for most people. It's not that technically precise, but it gives a practical understanding of what declination is, how to find the aspects of declination, and where to see declination in the world, like in the astrological apps or in the ephemeris. And the other way is precise, where we give the precise definition, we give technical details. Today we'll start with the simple definition, and you see those pictures in the slide. I use them to say that, for example, you want to watch TV, but you never did that. You're going to watch TV for the first time, and someone comes and starts explaining you the basics of electronics, how all those electrons go and make a picture in the TV, and not so many people will be happy about that. The better way to do is to give them a remote control and show which buttons to press, and then they might see with a beer and watch football without knowing even the most basic things about electronics. So we'll try the first approach first, the simple one. And this is how I'm going to do that. This is a definition, a simple definition, not technical. It's not very precise, but it's sufficient. Declination is the second dimension. That's it. But the purpose of the second dimension is that it complements the zodiacal position, allowing to precisely define a planet's position in the sky. It's still quite cumbersome, I would say. So let me tell you, why do we need a second dimension? Here is a geographical map. And imagine that in geography, we would use only longitude. You know that in geography, we use longitude and latitude, 2 dimensions. What if we only used longitude, 1 dimension? We might think that Edinburgh is very close or the same place on the earth as Timbuktu in Mali, because they both have the longitude of 3 degrees west. But that's what we do in astrology. We only use longitude. And sometimes we might think that 2 planets are in conjunction, or, well, with planets, you won't get that major difference in latitude. But with a planet and with a star, you can easily get them as far from each other as Edinburgh and Timbuktu. So we only use longitude in astrology. For example, here's a couple of astrological charts. And Jupiter, for example, in the first chart, its position is 22 degrees and 50 minutes of Aquarius. That's the ecliptic longitude of Jupiter expressed in the signs of the zodiac and their degrees and minutes. And all the planets, their positions are defined in the same way, using their ecliptic longitude. Or we call it zodiacal position, it's the same thing. Why it's not sufficient? Well, let me ask you one question. Which of these charts is for a basic, normal new moon? And which of them is for a total solar eclipse? Can you tell me that? Have a look. Usually there is a little trick which astrologers can use, because if a new moon or a full moon is close to the line of the lunar nodes, to the axis of the lunar nodes, then that's an eclipse. But in this case, let's see, the sun and the moon is in 12 degrees Scorpio, the lunar node is 11 Sagittarius. And here, the sun and the moon is 12 Sagittarius. The lunar node is a little bit closer, but the distance is not that much different. So how do you think which one of them is for the eclipse, because during the eclipse, the moon overlaps the sun, and we can't see the sun, yes, because the body of the moon closes the sunlight from us. Whereas in a normal new moon, they're still in the same direction, but the moon doesn't close the sun from us. So a normal astrological chart doesn't show us, it doesn't give us enough information to distinguish between a new moon and a total solar eclipse. And because here is the left chart is the new moon, and the right chart is the total solar eclipse. And the difference is that a distance between the sun and the moon in the second dimension when there is a new moon. So they don't overlap. There is some distance in the second dimension. And here there is little or no distance in the second dimension. So they do overlap. So the moon closes the sun from us. We don't see the second dimension in a normal astrological chart. So where can we see it? The next question. So I gave you a simple definition. Okay, the next slide will be the technical definition. And a little bit later, I will show you where exactly we can find this second dimension, where it can be and how it can be clearly shown, how we can work with it, how we can use it. But first, let's speak to those people who are a little bit technically minded, let's say, and give a precise definition of declination. Declination is simply the distance between a planet. Here is this little black ball is a planet or a star or any object in the sky. And declination is this distance from the celestial equator. That's the definition. Now a little bit about the peculiarities of the usage of declination in astrology. There are two astronomical systems of coordinates that can be used to define a location of anything. There are more, but now we'll be mentioning only two of them. One of them, which is most popular among astrologers, is the ecliptic system of coordinates. The ecliptic is, you probably know, is the apparent path of the sun around the sky through the year. So the sun moves along the ecliptic, and all the planets more or less move more or less close to the ecliptic. They follow the sun. So when we use an ecliptic longitude of the planet, we use its angular distance from the vernal equinox along the ecliptic. And this is the ecliptic longitude, which can be a degree and minute of the sign of the zodiac. This is what we use all the time, the ecliptic longitude. So what I'm suggesting is to use the second dimension. And there is an ecliptic latitude, which could be used as a second dimension. It's still within the same ecliptic system of coordinates, but we don't use it for some reason. Instead, in astrology, we use a coordinate from the other system of coordinates, which is equatorial. And that system is oriented along the celestial equator. And it also has two dimensions. One of them is right ascension, which is similar to ecliptic longitude. We won't use right ascension in this presentation, and we rarely use it in our astrology these days. And the other one, which is similar to the geographic latitude, is declination. So what I'm suggesting to use, and what many astrologers like Charles Jane used on a regular basis, is two dimensions. One of them is the ecliptic latitude from the ecliptic system of coordinates, and the other one is declination from the equatorial system of coordinates, which is a little bit not very logical, right? Why don't we use just the ecliptic latitude? And the answer is, well, there are a few different answers. One answer is that the ecliptic latitude of planets isn't very big. Its magnitude is not that informative for us. The declination changes in quite a longer the range in which declination changes is much wider. But that's not sufficient to justify this strange decision to use declination from the other system of coordinates. What's important, I think, here is that when we use declination, we use this very important natural cycle between equinoxes and solstices. And it's important in terms of how things happen in the world. Because if we have two charts of partners and their suns are in parallel, they will be at the same time in antithesia. That's the ancient kind of relationship between planets. So there is more than just the second dimension here when we use declination. And also, when we use declination, we use as a reference line the celestial equator, which is a projection of the Earth's equator. And therefore, what's happening in declination resonates well with what's happening on the Earth, so to say. And this is why perhaps all those astrologers who use declination on a regular basis and who consider that it is very important usually practice in some branch of astrology which is interested in things happening in the world rather than in a human soul, so to say. They're not psychological astrologers, so to say. They are interested in like financial astrology, astrometeorology, or forecasting, or methods of rectification. They're interested in real events, and that's why they use, by all means, declination, because declination seems to be especially important in those cases when we're working with real events, not with imaginary ones. So that was like a technical note on declination. But where to find declination? Is it okay. First, the aspects of declination. So planets can have declination. It's similar to geographic latitude. It can be north or south, or sometimes you will see in astrological software that the northern declination is shown with the plus sign or without a sign, and the southern declination is shown with the minus sign. Instead of showing north-south, it can be plus minus. And it can change from 0 to 90, like latitude can, geographic latitude. But in most cases, the declination of planets is within the range from 0 to 30. And what is the orb? Well, there are two aspects that can be formed in declination. Usually we use trine, conjunction, square. Those are all the aspects of longitude. That's the distance basically between planets in longitude. There are also two aspects that can be formed in declination. And one of them is parallel. This is when the declination of one planet is equal to the declination of the other planet. And the other one is contraparallel. This is when planets have the same declination by value, but the signs are different. One of them is, for example, we have a parallel if one planet is 10 degrees north and the other planet is 10 degrees north. And we have a contraparallel if one planet is 10 degrees north and the other planet is 10 degrees south. That's a contraparallel. But as always with aspects, we need to define the orb. For example, 10 degrees north and 10 degrees north is exactly a parallel, but 10 degrees north and 12 degrees north, is there a parallel between these planets or not? So there are a few different opinions about which orb should be used with parallels and contraparallels. In practice, I used for many years just 1 degree. Okay, so 10 and 11, there is a parallel. 10 and 12, there isn't. But then I've learned that Major Society, it's an interesting original school of astrology, they recommend 1 degree and 12 minutes. So I started using 1 degree and 12 minutes. But then I've met the opinion of Charles Jane. Charles Jane was indeed a technically advanced astrologer, and he noticed that when the planets are near the celestial equator, when the value of the declination is small, they move quickly in declination. And when they're close to the maximum value, to the solstices, they move very slowly. So as a result, what happens is that in any chart, when we consider the aspects in declination, parallels and contraparallels, there will be more aspects between planets in higher declinations because they move slowly, they stay long there. And there will be most aspects between them. So he decided that, you know what, the orb of the aspects of declination should depend on the declination of the planets. If they're in the low declination near the equator, the orb should be bigger. When the higher, close to the maximum declinations, it should be very small. And that's reasonable and that's logical. But the problem is, these days, we rarely define aspects manually. We use astrological software to define aspects, including aspects of declination. So we might follow the suggestions of Charles Jane, but only when software developers will implement that changeable scale of orbs for the aspects of declination for us. And as far as I know, nobody did that yet. So there are two aspects, parallel and contraparallel, but there are a few more important points in declination which we should note. They're not aspects, but they're like angular positions of planets or something like that. For example, a planet might have a declination close to 0, in which case it happens. Here, planet on the celestial equator has a declination close to 0, and that's important. It's like in a personal chart. It's similar to a planet on the ascendant, because the celestial equator is a very sensitive line. It's like resonates with things happening on the Earth, and when a planet touches it or is placed on the celestial equator, its symbolism is often clearly visible in the events on the Earth. So that's one important point. The second important point in the cycle of declination is that when planet is at the maximum declination of the sun, it becomes also especially important. This is the maximum declination of the sun at solar solstice and at winter solstice. At solar solstice, it's about 23 degrees, 26 minutes north. And at winter solstice, it's about 23 degrees, 26 minutes south. So when a planet is at this position, 23 degrees, 26 minutes precisely, it's similar to a position on the MC in a personal chart, something like that. So it becomes prominent, it becomes noticeable, its symbolism can show itself in the events in the world more clearly than usual. And finally, sometimes planets become out of bounds. They exceed the maximum declination of the sun, 23 degrees, 26 minutes, but that's a topic we are going to discuss a little bit later in this workshop. Since I mentioned parallels and contraparallels, there is an interesting question. Is there a difference between these aspects? Because some classical astrologers, I think William Lilly was one of them, they stated that parallel is akin to a conjunction and contraparallel is similar to opposition. But not all astrologers agree with that. There are basically two groups of astrologers, and in both groups there are quite prominent and important and well-known astrologers. one of the groups says, no, it's basically the same aspect. There is no difference. Parallel, contraparallel, it's the same aspect. And to this group belong Charles Carter, Ronald Davison, Roger Hudson, Cephariel, and Major Society. There's a typo. And Major Society. So they don't make any difference between these two aspects. And there is a group who says, yes, they indeed, the parallel is like conjunction, the contraparallel is like an opposition. There are also very experienced and important astrologers here, Jeff Meyer, Barbara Waters, Charles Jane himself. And it's not a very simple question, actually, because quite often parallels coincide with conjunction. It just astronomically happens so that in many cases, if there is a parallel between two planets, there may be also a conjunction. And in that case, this double aspect works as very, very powerful conjunction. It's called a planetary eclipse in some schools, or it's called occultation. But that's a very powerful aspect. And in that case, of course, parallel is like a conjunction. And again, astronomically, it might happen often that planets in contraparallel, not necessarily so, but they might form an opposition. And in that case, it's a very powerful opposition because it's again an aspect in two dimensions. And yes, in that case, I wouldn't argue a contraparallel will be similar to an opposition. But that's not always like that. For example, planets can be in a trine and also form a parallel or a contraparallel. It can be different. What I believe myself, I would agree that there is a difference between a parallel and a contraparallel, because there is a difference between in the way how they're formed, in the mechanics of these aspects. But the difference isn't as big normally on the average. It's not as big as between conjunction and opposition, unless, of course, contraparallel coincides with opposition. What I mean by the mechanics, if you look at the sky, as time passes, those planets that are in parallel have the same declination. They follow the same path. They follow the same line around the sky. And in this way, they're like coming together, a kind of joining. They're sharing the same path around the sky. And that's why they're in the aspect, let's say. Whereas when planets are in contraparallel, they don't follow the same path. They're on the different sides of the celestial equator. And in that case, why that aspect is important? Because the midpoint between the two planets falls exactly on the celestial equator. And therefore, I would believe that contraparallels are especially important in worldly events, in mundane astrology, because they touch, every contraparallel touches the celestial equator, and midpoints between declinations of planets are as important as midpoints between longitudes of planets, but they're very rarely used, and there are very few astrological packages that help us to define midpoints and declination. So again, I believe that in most cases, parallels and contraparallels differ between themselves, but I wouldn't define the difference. Certainly, it's on the average, it's not as huge as between a conjunction and an opposition. So the next topic is where to find declination. And now we have that logical break when I would like to invite you to ask questions if you have.
I think that was brilliant, Alexander. I think it's really, really clear. We haven't got any questions in the chat. I think because you've described it so well, there's very little room for confusion.
All right, thank you very much.
If
Please.
anybody does want to say anything, please feel free to unmute yourself. And Christiana Hinterleitner has, I'll just ask you to unmute, Christiana.
Well, thank you. I just agree to your yes, to your words. Sorry, my English is not that good.
Thank you very much. So the next topic, where to find declination, because we used to work with astrological software, and if we don't pay special attention to declination, then we just don't see it. But there are ways to make it more visible, and I think the champion among popular software packages is SolarFire, because in SolarFire there is such a feature, pages, and in pages at the bottom, at the bottom of the slide, you see it's written pages. In the pages you have that category general, and in the general category you will find a page called Decline, and if you choose it, then you will see a page similar to this. And this is the natal chart of Charlie Chaplin. And look what we have here. On the right-hand side, we have a normal natal chart where everything is in longitude. We don't see any declination. But on the left-hand side, we have a very valuable tool, which is the declination scale. And let's have a look. What we see in this declination scale. At the bottom, there is 0 degrees. This is the celestial equator. And planets which are close to the bottom are close to the celestial equator. At the top, it's 30 degrees. It's around the maximum distance, the maximum declination a planet can have. And you see this dotted line. This is a maximum declination of the sun, 23 degrees and 26 minutes around that. And if a planet is above this line, like Venus in Charlie Chaplin's case, it's an out of bounds planet, but we'll speak about this a little bit later in the presentation. And here it's very, using this scale, it's very easy to find aspects of declination. For example, look at the sun. The sun is quite close to the moon, but they're on the different sides of the scale. The left-hand side, we'll see it's north. The right-hand side of the scale is south. So the sun and the moon have very similar declinations, but one of them is north and the other one is south. So what's that? That's a contraparallel. So there is a contraparallel between the sun and the moon in Charlie Chaplin's case. And if we take the sun and Pluto, they're quite close because this is 1 degree, right? And if we use the orb of 1 degree and a little bit more, 12 minutes, then there's clearly close to 1 degree. So there might be a parallel between the sun and Pluto because they're on the same side of the scale. They're both north. And there's also a table which lists the longitude, the zodiacal position, the travel, how much moved the planets during the day, and also the declination. And we can spot the declination, for example, the sun and the moon. Okay, the declination of the moon is minus 10 degrees 16 minutes. Minus means south, as I mentioned before. And the declination of the sun is 10 degrees 24 minutes. So they're indeed quite close. There's just 8 minutes of difference in their value, but they're of opposite signs. So this is a contraparallel. Still, the aspect like that is not shown in the chart, but we can see it here quite clearly. And what else did we see? The sun and Pluto. The declination of the sun is 10 degrees, and Pluto, whereas Pluto is 9 degrees 27 minutes. 10 degrees 24 minutes is 9 degrees. Yeah, it's just a little, the orb is just a little bit under 1 degree. So there is, yes, a parallel between the sun and Pluto. And this is a very convenient page. It's out of the box. You don't need to create your own page. So SolarFire, some other software packages, they at least will show you the declinations. But there are, you might need to find how to see declination in different software packages. But usually it's, well, I think almost all of them show declination in one or another way. And you can simply compare declinations of planets and see if there are aspects of declination or not, or if some of them are close to the celestial equator, or if some of them exceed 23 degrees 26 minutes and therefore are out of bounds. Yeah, let's have a look. Venus, in Charlie Chaplin's case, its declination is 23 degrees 31 minutes, a little bit over than 26 minutes. So yes, Venus is out of bounds in Charlie Chaplin's case. And this is another very convenient tool created or present in SolarFire, and also in the version. It's not a version of SolarFire for Mac, but the software Astro Gold. It was created, I think, by the same developer as SolarFire, so it has the same kind of grid. It doesn't offer that declination scale. It doesn't offer those customized pages, but it offers this aspect grid, which is quite convenient when working with charts. What does it show? For Charlie Chaplin, the lower left half of this grid shows the usual aspects of longitude. We can see that, like the sun is conjunct Mercury with quite a wide orb, and so on. All the usual aspects. Mercury is trine Saturn, and these are familiar aspects. And in the upper right half of the aspect grid, we see the aspects of declination. This is how their symbols look. We remember we found that there is a contraparallel between the sun and the moon, and here it is. It's two parallel lines, and they're crossed by the third line. That's a contraparallel, and A means applying, and the distance between the difference from the absolutely precise aspect is just 8 minutes. And we also remember that the sun was in parallel with Pluto, and here is the sign of parallel, just two parallel lines, and the aspect is separating, and it's a little bit under 1 degree. Would you interpret, for example, for Charlie Chaplin, that the Pluto and Sun have a conjuncting aspect, conjuncting the Pluto and the Sun? You mean a parallel between them? It's, well, the interpretation is, well, we could use the interpretation as it's used. It just joins together two planets parallel. If the Sun is individuality and Pluto is power, then a parallel between the Sun and Pluto is a powerful individuality, is a power which impresses people and so on. It's similar to how one would interpret a conjunction between two planets. So that was SolarFire. Other software packages are not that convenient in working with declinations, and therefore I want to tell you about one rather unique software package which is being created by a Russian software developer, Dmitry Potapov, and it's called Aster Processor Zeus. And you can find the upper link shows you the page, the web page where you can download the distribution of this package. It exists for quite a few years, but the developer still thinks that it's better, and the best way to interpret, I think, both parallel and contraparallel is to if you take a textbook approach, take the description for the conjunction of these two planets. I think that's a feasible approach. So yeah, thank you for producing the links in the chat. So the first link shows to the page where you can download the distribution. And because it's a beta software, it's still free. And the developer still didn't define any pricing for it. And I'm asking, some people are asking, give me the price, I want to pay and know that it's, you know, forever. But he still believes that there are a few features to add, a little bit polish to add and so on, because it's not ready for the prime time. So it's still free. You can install it for free. And if it won't become, and if it will be, and if it will cost money in the future, then it won't be as expensive as, let's say, SolarFi or something. The price will be very reasonable, I think. And but right now it's free. And below, the link below is my short video, which shows the first steps with Astro Processor Zeus, because it's so new, it doesn't have proper documentation how to install it, what to do with it. And I created this short video which will help you to make the first steps. I won't be, if we'll have time and then I will show you this software. It's running in my computer, but at the moment, you can use this short video to see how and what to do with it. What are the benefits? The benefits of using this software is because I worked together with the developer and asked him to implement certain things which are convenient and important when working with declination and with aspects of declination, which are not existent in any other software packages. This is a natal chart of Keanu Reeves. This is how it looks in Astro Processor Zeus, or I will call it Zeus for simplicity in the future. What's interesting here? The first interesting thing is that you can see, look at this arc, this pink or pinkish arc. Here is another one, here is another one. This is how the aspects of declination are shown. And this is a screenshot, so you don't see it. But if you hovered your mouse on top of one of these arcs in the running software, which I might do in the end if we have time, you will see the description, like a parallel, like here we have Jupiter and Uranus, perhaps. Let's see. Here we have the declination. The declination of Jupiter is 18 degrees, 6 minutes, and that's not Uranus. Okay, here is another way to find what this is the aspect table. And this aspect table is unique because it displays both the aspects of longitude and declination. And let's see which planet has a parallel or contraparallel with Jupiter. And clearly it's Venus, and it's also Pluto. So this arc shows a parallel with Jupiter, of Jupiter with Pluto. And there is also a parallel with Venus. So this chart, or this software, displays the aspects of declination in the natal chart, in the astrological chart itself, in the aspects table. And you can also have a look at what's the declination of them here. The other important feature of this software is that it offers the same declination scale. Actually, it was me who suggested to add this declination scale to the software, as in SolarFi. And here we see north on the right-hand side, south on the left-hand side, but otherwise it's the same. Again, this is the line showing the maximum declination of the sun. Chiron is close to the celestial equator because it's close to zero. And you see Uranus and the sun are in parallel because they're on the same side. And Venus and Pluto and Jupiter are all in parallel here in this scale of declination, again for Keanu Reeves. And this is a unique tool because many astrologers, Charles Jane, for example, are emphasizing the importance of midpoints in declination. But how to calculate them manually? It's not a big deal, right? It's plus, minus, divide by 2, and it's not. But to do that on a practical basis, we used to having software to calculate midpoints for us. And in Zeus, it doesn't calculate midpoints like that, but it gives us this little dial, which works very nicely in declination. For example, we can see that Mercury is in the midpoint in declination between, let's say, the Moon and Neptune, or Mars and Neptune. Between the Moon and Neptune is more precise, 7 degrees, 7 minutes. And also in the midpoint between Mars and Saturn. And that can tell you something important, because midpoints in declination are at least as important as midpoints in longitude. Let's have a look. Let's see the declinations of Mercury in Keanu Reeves' chart, and the Moon and Neptune. Is it really in the midpoint between them? Mercury is 4 degrees with minutes, the Moon is 23, and Neptune is -14. Yeah, it looks like it is indeed right in the middle between these two planets. And Zeus helps us to find those midpoints. Also, if you just want to see the current positions of planets, you can go to my website, which is at the bottom. You see www.lunarium.co.uk. It's a new version of my website. It was designed for mobile screens. This is how it looks on a regular screen. On a mobile screen, it will adjust to the width of the screen, and it shows both the longitudes of the planets. I created this screenshot a couple of days ago, and their declinations. And also, it is showing, thank you, Chris. Also, it is showing the aspects, both in longitude and in declination. And these little funny symbols are, well, in major astrology, they have certain labels for certain aspects. So this aspect parallel with Jupiter has some meaning in major astrology, but that's just a curious thing to know. So this is how you can see the current declinations and aspects of declinations. And also, if there is an OOB, if a planet is out of bounds, at some point you will see an OOB here and the link to an article describing what out of bounds is. Next thing is we can use the ephemeris to see how declination of planets changes over time. Ephemeris are very important and very convenient for many astrologers, but unfortunately, the most popular American ephemeris, they don't have declination in them. Raphael ephemeris do have it, but also there are free, available to everyone, ephemeris offered at Astro.com website created by Alois Trindle. And here is, it was redesigned recently, but you just go to astro.com and you open the main menu. And in it, you see ephemeris. And I suggest you to go straight to 9,000 years ephemeris. And you will see a page like this. It offers ephemeris for many different centuries. And we just need to open a section for the century we are interested in, for example, the 21st century. And these are links to the ephemeris and the aspectarians, but this is not what we need because we're interested in declination. So we find in this section, this subsection titled With Declination and Latitude. And then we just click on the link to the year we're interested in. And we see a page like this. At the top, it's a normal ephemeris page with the longitudes of planets. And at the bottom, there are declinations and latitudes. Here it is magnified. Decal is the declination. And see, it can be south or north. this is how these are declinations are listed for every day. Here you can see that the moon is out of bounds because its declination exceeds 23 degrees 26 minutes. But we are not paying attention to latitudes. Lat is latitude, so we don't use it in this presentation, at least. We only pay attention to declination. So there are different ways to find declination in the software, in the ephemeris, or on a web page. The next question is why the declination or the knowledge of declination is valuable. And this is again a logical break where I could suggest you to ask questions if you have.
We don't have any questions in the chat box. If anybody wants to say anything, please put your hand up or unmute yourself. No, we don't have any.
No. Okay.
Have any questions? So
let's continue then. So far we told about what declination is, where to find it, and it's not very difficult to find declination of planets or the aspects of declination. But why do you need it? Still, there is a little bit of extra effort. There's something you might be not used to. So why should you do that effort? What's the benefit of that? So the next topic is why the knowledge of declinations is valuable. And Charles Jane, when answering this question, offered the chart of Walt Disney. He was a successfully powerful and he was a fantastically successful and powerful man who achieved a lot of very important results in the world of multiplication. Oh, what's the word in English? Sorry. Well, you know what Walt Disney did. And his Neptune in the 10th house at the top of the chart is a very good symbol of what he created in his life and in the world. But the problem with this Neptune is that it is, at least when we look at the aspects of longitude, which we are used to use, this Neptune is very poorly integrated into the chart. Look, which aspect does it have? Some sesqui-square, some opposition, and some semi-square perhaps, and that's it. Why it is so poorly aspected, why it's so poorly integrated into the chart, which means into the whole life of Walt Disney. And to answer this question, we should look at that aspect chart, and then we'll see that Neptune is actually very well integrated into the chart, that there are many different aspects and forms. And also other planets have a lot of aspects in declination, and we wouldn't notice that. We wouldn't know that Neptune is so well aspected if we didn't see the declination side of things. And here is the positions of his planets, and we can see that the declination of Neptune is 22 degrees with minutes, and Uranus is 22 degrees with minutes, and Saturn and Jupiter, and they're all very close to each other. So that's a very important part, more than a half of information, I would say, about the natal chart of Walt Disney than what we could see without declination. And this is one way to show that declination might be necessary and very important when working with an astrological chart. But there are also many people who wouldn't have that many aspects in declination. Walt Disney is unique, and unique examples are not very good to illustrate the point. Also, on some occasions, or on many occasions actually, you might use directions, transits, progressions, and you know something important happened in the life of a person, but you don't see any transits in longitude or any aspects in longitude in the forecasting method you are using. But if you look into declination, you might see the answer, you might see what happened there. Because, and if you remember that some astrologers believe that parallel is more powerful than conjunction, then something might be hidden from you in that second dimension. But still, it's arguable whether, and not every important event offers that important aspects in declination. Where I think the most convincing, what I think is the most convincing way to show the importance of the aspects of declination is in synastry, is in the non-trivial relationships, in analyzing non-trivial relationships. I think this is the best way, and I show you a few examples. What I mean by non-trivial relationships, it's when partners, in order to be together, do something extraordinary. They neglect existing social norms, they sacrifice a career, they go against the opinion of their family, and very often they live happily ever after, as they say. And very often in such cases, the analysis of the mutual aspects of longitude does not provide a satisfactory understanding of why these people did something as unusual as that. And my favorite example is Prince Harry and Meghan. Well, think about that. Prince Harry is a British prince. He could marry every girl. Well, he wouldn't. I don't think he had any difficulties with finding a spouse if he wanted to find a spouse. But he married someone who is 3 years older than him, who was already divorced, and she's a foreigner. And I'm sure British royal family was quite against of his choice. But again, he insisted and he followed this. So there should be something special about this case. There should be some power in his choice. And we as astrologers, we expect astrology to show us something important in this case. And this is and these are their mutual aspects. I should note that I use the orb of 3 degrees only for the aspects of longitude, quite narrow, but I think that precise aspects are the most important, and they show the most important things. Also, I didn't use the angular cusps because I think we should try to rectify a chart before using angular cusps, otherwise they're not that reliable. So what do we see here? What are the mutual aspects in this marriage? Well, her sun is square his Saturn. I circled the most precise, I think, aspects, or the most important, I think. Her sun is square his Saturn. Her Venus is sextile his Saturn. And his sun is square her Neptune. That's it. There are other aspects also, but these are the most precise. And also look at this empty space here. These are the aspects between the luminaries and the personal planets. And I think in personal relationships, there should be something quite important in this space, but there isn't. So I know astrologers who, after receiving the news of Harry being with Meghan, say that no, nothing is going to happen from this relationship. There's just no energy between them. There are no aspects between them. So is astrology so mute because they live together, and they not just live together, they separated from the royal family. They live their own lives, so there should be some power in their relationship. But astrology doesn't show us anything important here, or does it? And here we come to limitation of most, if not all, of astrological packages existing currently on the market. I was told that you can fine-tune solar fire in such a way that it shows in this table of aspects was created with Astro Gold, which produces very beautiful charts and tables, especially for presentations. But there is no way in it to show aspects of declination in these relationships table. And I was told by someone that in SolarFi you can create such a table with the aspects of declination in it. But maybe I'm not an expert in SolarFi, but I didn't find a way to do that. Instead, I spoke to the developer of Aster Processor Zeus, and he produced a table. But first, let's think. Maybe Harry was just that unlucky that he never met a girl better than Meghan, with whom he would have a better synastry. And I found that one of his previous girlfriends was Cressida Bonus, a British model, young, attractive. And this is a table showing aspects between Harry's chart and Cressida Bonus's chart. And look, I think it looks much more interesting. Look at this space between the luminaries and the personal planets. Her Venus is trine his Venus, her Venus is sextile his Mars. And I think when it comes to Venus and Mars and personal relationships, quincunxes are not that bad as well. Her Sun is trine to his Pluto, a little bit more of Uranus than might be needed for stable relationships, but there is not a bad synastry. Even the square between the Moon and Venus is not so bad for personal relationships. And they lived actually together, as far as I know, for some lengthy time. And there were already rumors that they will get married at some point, but they didn't. Harry decided to go with Meghan. Why? Again, the normal astrological aspects don't tell us that, the aspects of longitude. And so I asked the developer of Astro Processor Zeus to create a table displaying. It doesn't look as nice as that one, but it does show us the aspects of declination between the partners. Vertically, we have Prince Harry, and horizontal is Meghan. And look at what we have here. His Sun makes a parallel to her Moon. Her Sun makes a parallel to his Moon. And that's something extraordinary. Imagine you saw a couple where the man's Sun was in conjunction with the woman's Moon, and the woman's Sun was in conjunction with the man's Moon. What would you say? That would be an extraordinary, powerful relationship, wouldn't it? And I think it goes back to Ptolemy, who stated that there are some signs of a marriage between people. And I think the Sun-Moon conjunction was at the top of that list. And here we have it mutual. So, and remember, some astrologers believe that parallel is more potent than a conjunction. So I think this is an extraordinary aspect, mutual aspect, and it shows that they were born for each other. There are other interesting aspects here, but I think this is the core of their relationships, and this is what brings them together and keeps them together and will keep them together. So that's one example. And yeah, and what about Cressida Bonus? The same kind of table for Harry and Cressida Bonus. They still have some aspects, some rather good, impressive aspects. You see, this is an aspect both in longitude, square, and in declination, counterparallel. So it's quite strong, quite important. There is a lot of feeling between them, but there is nothing between the luminaries. And I believe if we use the principle as above, so below, what is the most visible in the sky? The luminaries. So the most important things should be shown in astrology by the luminaries, including synastry. We would also expect something between the luminaries, and they didn't have something. So they had a love story, but they haven't decided to live together ultimately. Another very interesting couple, Edward VIII and Wallis Simpson. In this case, a British king sacrificed it's more than a career being a king. right? It's the whole life. So he abdicated the throne. A question, is it also possible to look at charts if you don't know the exact time of birth? Well, it depends what you use, but declination makes certain things easier. I will show you one example where you will see that declination is might be less sensitive to the time of birth. So Edward VIII, who abdicated the throne to have an opportunity to marry Wallis Simpson. So there should be something powerful between them, shouldn't there? Because what kind of passions should be, what kind of attraction should be between a king and a woman and she's a foreigner again, and she was twice divorced, if I remember. So again, for a king to find a woman, and he decided to marry her against all the opinions of everyone. So let's have a look at the synastry. Do you see again this empty space? Well, in this square of personal planets and luminaries, there's only a square between her Sun and his Mars. This is the relationship. Is it powerful enough to bring them together and to keep them together and to make him to abdicate the throne? I don't think so. There is a Mercury-Jupiter conjunction. There is something else. Venus-Uranus opposition, not good for a relationship. Again, the astrology, as used most of the time nowadays, is strangely mute here. It doesn't tell us anything. It doesn't show us anything we expect it to show, because such a powerful relationship is not shown in the mutual aspects. Okay, let's have a look at the aspects of declination. And look what we see here. Their suns are just 1 minute from an absolutely precise parallel. They're not in conjunction. They're quite close in the zodiac, but not we wouldn't say it's a conjunction. But they in a very precise parallel. It's like their hearts are together. And I think that parallel between the suns especially is more important in synastry than a conjunction, because a conjunction of the sun, there is this combust or burning, it's very powerful, the sun, and if a planet makes a conjunction with the sun, it's in some way damaged. Many astrologers, traditional especially, believe that it's overpowered by the sun. But when there is a parallel, there is no that burning. They don't touch physically, but they have this very important aspect between them. So this is a very, very important, I think. But then also her Venus makes a precise parallel to this parallel between the suns, and his Jupiter makes a parallel to these suns, and then his Jupiter and her Venus makes a parallel between themselves. So this combination of the suns and Jupiter and Venus forms a unique combination of aspects, or unique configuration of aspects, which is only visible in declination. And without declination, we don't see it. Without declination, we don't understand what brings these people together. And there are other aspects which are only seen in declination, which might be important for understanding, like this contraparallel between his moon and her Pluto. And there are more details here. You might have a look. That was another example. And yet another example. I'm telling you, there are many examples. I'm just showing you the most striking ones, the most interesting ones. They're about people who are most widely known. King Charles III and his wife Camilla, or should I say Queen Consort, I think. I'm still getting used to the new titles. But again, if you remember the history, he had a family. He had a young, beautiful wife with 2 kids, and he pretty much abandoned them to stay with his beloved woman. So there should be something quite powerful between Charles and Camilla. We should expect that from the astrological viewpoint. Astrology should show us something important, shouldn't it? Okay, let's have a look. These are the aspects in longitude, mutual aspects. Okay, we see some trines. There is a trine between their suns. There's a trine between his sun and her Mercury. So they're probably good friends. They can talk to each other. There are some other aspects, but do they really show us why a man can abandon an existing family to choose this woman? I don't think so. I don't think so. And especially look at the aspects of Venus. There is nothing. There are no aspects of Venus. And we think this is a lovely relationship, right? A lovely relationship and no aspects between Venuses. The Venuses don't make any aspects to the natal chart of the partner. How can that be? Well, that's because we don't see the full picture without the aspects of declination, you know. Before showing you the table with the aspects of declination, I want to show you the natal chart of Camilla. And the interesting thing here is a very precise conjunction between her moon in Cancer, very strong moon, and her Venus. This is such a powerful center of femininity. And if she attracted someone so strongly to do something extraordinary, and if her femininity made some men to do something extraordinary, we would think that this should be shown in their relationships. So this moon or Venus should manifest somehow in their relationship. The moon is, you see, its declination is 26:15, so it's out of bounds. It's difficult to form an aspect in declination when the planet is that far out of bounds. We'll speak more about out of bounds planets, but but Venus is within the bounds. So we will, very strange that we didn't see any aspects to her Venus, to Camilla's Venus, and now we switch to the table showing the aspects of declination, and this is Camilla's Venus, and see how many aspects it makes to Charles's planets. There is an aspect, a contraparallel to his Mars, quite important for love relationships. There is a Venus, there is an aspect quite precise to his Jupiter, to his Uranus, to his Pluto. And if we look closer, there are some also very powerful aspects, like a contraparallel between his Mars and her Pluto. Again, very powerful, very passionate relationship. And we can see it only with the help of declination. Without declination, we see nothing. And yet another example, the last one with relationships, because I could just keep showing you. There are many relationships where you can see that without declination, there is no way to understand it. George and Amal Clooney. Yes, of course, George didn't abdicate any throne to marry Amal, but because of his reputation of an eternal bachelor, it was actually very strange for many people that he ultimately decided to marry someone like Amal. And again, we think astrology should show us something about this, something special. Yes, we can see many aspects in this luminaries and personal planet square, in this space. But look what kind of aspects there are. A square, an opposition, a square, an opposition. They're not very comfortable aspects. They don't explain why they decided to stay together for an eternal bachelor. And there is one aspect that looks promising between her moon and his Venus, but we don't know the time of birth of Malik Luni. So the position of her moon was calculated for midday, for 12 o'clock. And we don't know if the moon is there, so we don't know if this aspect exists. So there are aspects, but they're not convincing why these people are together. And then we look again at the aspects, including the aspects of declination. And you can see that the square between the suns is also a contraparallel, which is like an aspect between the luminaries, which is a strong aspect, because this contraparallel makes it more stable, more potent. It's remember, people believe that it's more important than a conjunction, then it's more important than a square, certainly. So this brings their suns together. But also there is a parallel between his moon and her moon. And here you can remind me that we don't know her time of birth, right? But the thing is, when on the day when Amal was born, the moon was close to the maximum declination of the sun. So it moved quite slowly. And as a result, no matter whether Amal was born in the very beginning of that day or in the very end of that day, still her moon will make a parallel to George's moon. And this is again, you see an aspect between the luminaries, between the suns, very strong, and between the moons. And that's what I think explains the strength of their relationship. So that was a way to tell you that declinations are very important, that without knowing the declinations and the aspects of declinations, you will miss a lot in astrology. So that's again a logical break where, if you wish, you can ask some questions.
Well, again, thank you, Alexander. Nothing in the chat box. You already answered Jeanette's question about not knowing the time of birth and just given a brilliant example of it. Anybody else want to ask any questions at this point?
Right, so let's continue then. And the next topic is secondary progressed moon in declination. There are whole methods of forecasting designed to work with declination. Secondary progressed moon is very often used in astrology because it's very convenient, because it takes 1 month to cover 1 degree of the zodiac, so we can use it in our forecasting very conveniently, month by month. But now we're speaking about the movement of the moon in declination. There is also a cycle, like there is a cycle of synodic lunar cycle, sidereal lunar cycle. Synodic is 29.5 days, sidereal is like 27.5 days. But there is also a cycle in declination. For example, it's a period between the moon crossing the celestial equator, one crossing between other, and that cycle is a little bit unstable. It can be, I think, from 27 to 24 to 30 days. So it's a little bit unstable, but anyway, there is a cycle. And some astrologers based an approach or a method of forecasting based exactly on that declination of the moon in secondary progression. For example, and all this you can find very described and discussed in much detail in the article by Karen Christino, The Progressed Moon in Declination, which was published in Geocosmic magazines in spring 1998. And I think you can find it on the internet available, or on the Facebook. There is a group dedicated to declination and the aspects of declination, and this article can be found there as well. So you will find more details in this article. But here's the idea. An astrologer named John Hansen called this cycle of the secondary progressed moon, or what he saw in the cycle, the earnings cycle. The idea is then when the progressed moon headed north, which means in the interval from its extreme south declination and extreme north declination, it goes up in the graph. I will show you the graph in a moment. For now, just imagine that this is okay. Let me show you. It's like a wave. So the moon moves from, where's my mouse? Here it is. The moon moves from its extreme south declination to its extreme north declination. So he says that when the moon is somewhere here, the personal earning power is on the increase. The native is more likely to earn. And when it goes south, instead, earning becomes more difficult, like here. This is where the moon goes from the extreme north declination to the extreme south. And this is a period covering quite a few years, actually. It's quite a lengthy period. And there's another astrologer, L.H. Morrison, who elaborated on this approach. And he says that on the upsweep, the individual is optimistic and thinks well of himself. That's why employment perhaps tends to be fortunate and easily got. And in the downside cycle, people get cheated of their wages, underpaid, subject to discrimination, and their self-esteem suffers. And therefore, the role of the astrologer is very important to see if the moon is close to, for example, there is a long and difficult period when the person couldn't earn properly, and then he or she is coming to the bottom of this chart, and the astrologer should warn the person that something good is coming your way, and then there will be years of more income, of more earning power. And the important life changes are likely when the moon is at the top, at the bottom, or crosses the equator. So the important life changes are probable here, and when the moon is crossing the equator, here as well. And this is a secondary progressed moon in declination chart, created again with Aster Processor Zeus, with its feature graphic ephemeris. And I believe, if I will have time, I will demonstrate it to you, that the graphic ephemeris produced by Astro Processor Zeus are the best possible of all. I tried them in SolarFire, in Janus, in some other software packages, but they're the best in Astro Processor Zeus. So if you will take time to play with this software, you will enjoy it. And this is the cycle of earnings, so the cycle of the secondary progressed moon for Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple. And you see arrows showing, this is an illustration from my book, so I spent some time to find events corresponding to different points on this graph. Let's have a look. Let's switch a little bit between this graph and the list of events. You can see that events 1, 2, 3, 4 happened when the moon was going upwards, and these are the events. The first event is they created the first commercial product, Apple I, and that was the first success. The second event was Apple II. It was more popular. It was even more successful than Apple I. The third event was simply a very successful year financially. I think the net worth of Steve Jobs increased like 10 times or something like that. The fourth event is they created Macintosh, and that was the first computer with a graphical user interface in the world. Was one of the most successful products in the history of Apple. But then there was the fifth event when Jobs was fired from the company he created. This is it. It's close to the top. It's a little bit, we would expect it perhaps here, but it happened here. And I will tell you something else. I will tell you that we should use this chart. Oh, thank you very much, Chris, for producing a link to this article. It's a wonderful article. I recommend to read it. And there are some other factors that influence the nature of events. So Steve Jobs was fired, event number 5, and then event number 6, he created Next. The idea was to create the computer of the future, and he was trying to create both the hardware, which was produced in the United States. He built, I think, a factory to produce those computers of the future, and the software for them. And it was mostly a failure. They tell us, those who worked with this method tell us that when the moon goes down, it's better to do things that are not directly about earning money. They might be creative things, or maybe writing a book, or raising a child, or doing something else. I don't know, maybe building a house, something that is not directly aimed at earning money. And it's very good if you're on this descending part of the graph and your partner is on the ascending, then you could delegate earning money to a partner and have some creativity really released when the moon goes down. So Steve Jobs tried to create that next computer, and it was a mixed result. The result was mixed because the physical part of it, the hardware part, failed because the computer proved to be too expensive. Nobody wanted to buy it, and so that was all that factory. It was sold, dismantled. I don't know. It was a failure. But the software which was created, it became the basis of the new Mac OS, which was later created and which was Steve Jobs' comeback to this company. Let's see this event number 7. It's on the down slope, but is it positive or negative? 7, Toy Story. Steve Jobs switched his activities, his brain power to another project. And at this point, they released Toy Story, which was a very successful cartoon movie. And it was a creative project, right? This is why we can say it was on the down slope, but the project was very creative. But there is some other factor in play here. What I'm telling here is that you should use this graph together with other planets in the natal chart, with other progressed planets. You can see where the moon is, what's actually happening in the chart. This graph is just one view. It's just one dimension. But to see the whole picture, you might need to see the whole thing, what's happening in the chart, because what the progressed moon was making at that time, I checked, and the progressed moon was parallel to the sun and parallel to Neptune, which is quite symbolic to the success in a creative project. There's something else happening, not just this earning cycle. And number 8, again at the helm of Apple, and then number 9 is iPod, a phenomenal success, a new market for Apple, and number 10 is iPhone, another phenomenal success. Here they are. See, here the tide turned for Steve Jobs, and he was very successful again. When I observed a graph like this for myself, I found that a lot of good things happen in terms of earning happened when it moved up, including my move to Scotland. I became a student of a Scottish university. Then I started working in the UK as a software developer. It was all very good. I had a decent income. Then it came to the top, and started going downside. And then indeed, I felt that my fortune is not available anymore, because I worked on a good position in a large bank, but then I felt that people want me to push out from this position somehow, and I left it and I found another job, which was a kind of interesting creative job for me. It was iPhone development, which is very keen on at that time, but the salary was the same and the benefits package was non-existent. So it was a worse job in terms of earning, more interesting in terms of creativity. But then something interesting happened, because there was only one iPhone job in Scotland at that time, and I decided to move down south. So I went to London and immediately found another job with a big company, which offered me a higher salary. And then after a month, because that company was a little bit chaotic and couldn't provide a workspace for me, and I kept working on my own computer and so on, there were some difficulties. I found still another job in the city, and there was a fantastic salary I never thought of. And in the evening, or in the autumn of that year, I became a contractor on short-term contracts, and I've got a crazy rate, and I was working from home. So my earning power increased very powerfully, although the moon was on the downslope. So what happened? Why? And when I looked at the secondary progressions in my own natal chart, I found that at that time, when all those crazy things were happening, what happened is that the progressed moon made a precise conjunction with the progressed Mars right on my MC. And my Mars is the ruler of the ascendant, so that was quite an important progression. And it overlapped what the graph, the earning graph, was saying. So what I'm suggesting to you, so if you use this method, do pay attention to what the moon is doing in the secondary progression in the natal chart. It's interesting. It gives interesting results, but it's not sufficient by itself, perhaps. Okay, another logical break, and I need to suggest you an opportunity to ask questions, if you wish. Out of bounds planets, the next topic.
Yep, again, nobody in the chat box.
All right.
And nobody's got their hand up, so unless anyone's got any questions, let's continue.
So let's continue then.
Yeah, Francesca just said it's really clear, so thank you.
Thank you very much. What I'm going to tell you about now, I need to mention this very important person. I believe that it was her, an American astrologer with the name you can see written on the screen on the slide, who introduced the idea of out-of-bounds planets into astrology in the West. I don't think anybody before her used or paid attention to this out-of-bounds status of planets, but there are a few puzzles about her, starting from her name. While her first name was Catherine, I think, but she preferred to write it like KT, which is okay. But then his surname, when I was communicating with American astrologers in the group on the Facebook, they believed that it should be pronounced as bear, like an animal, you know, bear. But I didn't think like that. So I live in a multinational village here in Bulgaria. I had a French neighbor, so I asked her, "Is this a French surname? How to pronounce it?" And she told me, "No, this is not French. This is probably Dutch." And then I found that some neighbors have a daughter who is married to a Dutchman, and we sent them this surname and asked him to record how to pronounce it, and the result is Böhre, Böhre. So Katie Böhre. So that's how I'm trying to pronounce it. So she popularized the idea of out-of-bounds planets among the astrologers, and she wrote a book, Declination, the Other Dimension. And as far as I understand, she had an agreement with the American Federation of Astrologers to keep her book in print even after her death, which indeed the case, and this book is still in print. I bought it on Amazon. And there are the other two sources which I find very valuable about the out-of-bounds planets, especially the out-of-bounds moon, is the article, a large and detailed article by Steve Forrest. Here is a link to it. I think Chris already, yeah, I did it. Thank you very much. And a book by Paul Newman, Declination in Astrology. All this is very interesting and valuable. And I will give you a summary, and including my own findings. What's the idea? The idea is that the maximum declination of the sun is approximately 23 degrees 26 minutes, as I mentioned. Actually, it changes a little bit. In the 20th century, it was closer to 23 degrees 26 minutes. And you can see this value in the ephemeris for the month you're interested in. It is shown as the declination of the ecliptic or something like that, or inclination of the ecliptic or something like that. But you will see the value which is close to this value. It differs slightly. So the maximum declination of the sun is approximately 23 degrees 26 minutes, but other planets can exceed this declination. The moon in particular can go over 28 degrees. Mercury can go to almost 26 degrees. Venus, about 28 degrees. Mars can be sometimes close to 30 degrees. And Jupiter and Uranus also can be out of bounds, just under 24 degrees. Pluto sometimes slightly beyond 30, goes the furthest. And important that Saturn and Neptune never go beyond the maximum declination of the sun, at least in our historical period. Actually, the ability of plane to go out of bounds depends on the position of its nodes. Like for the moon, it's lunar nodes. I might have time to mention the peculiarities of the moon and the lunar nodes. But at the moment, we are saying that Saturn and Neptune never go beyond the maximum declination of the sun. They cannot be out of bounds. Now, the symbolism, why is this important? What does it mean? So the planet goes beyond the area which is visited by the sun. So it like goes beyond the influence of the sun. And if the sun symbolizes the central power, like a king or a president, the government, the authorities, then the out-of-bounds planet finds itself out of their reach. We can say that it's in a dark forest outside of the city. In the city, everything is safe. There is light, there is police. And in the forest outside, it's very different, isn't it? So how would the planet feel outside of the influence of the sun in that forest? It depends on the planet, right? Or like a person. So some person can be frightened, vulnerable, lost, unsure where to go and what to do in that dark forest. But other person can say, oh, I'm free, finally. I'm allowed to do anything that I was previously disallowed, anything I can imagine. So that's like the scale of or range of manifestations of out-of-bounds planet, from being lost to being happy to be free and do anything they want. And there is a vast array of possibilities, from committing a crime because nobody is looking, no police, or doing something extraordinarily good, which wasn't approved by the society before, but not matching the expectations of society, to being unsure, being lost, being unable to do anything. Also, we can say that the sun symbolizes the light of reason, and reason usually plays a positive role, but it can also be limiting. There are different stereotypes and filters which filter our impressions about the world. It can be telling us, reason can be telling us that something isn't possible, so we shouldn't even try it. An out-of-bounds planet, and the abbreviation is OOB, out-of-bounds planet, can make a person a genius because he or she is outside of the filters or stereotypes of reason. It can help him or her to find an unusual solution for a problem that everyone thought was impossible to solve because they were following those stereotypes. But it is also possible to go crazy there in the darkness of the realm outside of reason. So it can be showing like not exactly proneness, but I would expect that out of bounds planets can be weaker in terms of how reliable is a person against like psychological stresses, that they can become, you know, problematic in a very stressful emotional situation or something like that. It is typical for a person born with one or more out of bounds planets to stand alone outside the crowd and to reject things that most others would consider desirable or prestigious. And I think this idea, reject things that most others would consider desirable or prestigious, is very important in understanding the out of bounds planets. I've got an out of bounds Mars myself, and again, I don't want to leave the main topic for now, but if I have a few minutes in the end, I will tell you my own story, how I disregarded what other people would think is very desirable. When we are looking at the out-of-bounds status of planets, we are mostly interested in the Moon, Mercury, Venus, and Mars. Obviously, the Sun never goes out of bounds. So personal planets and the Moon. Jupiter is also of interest because it goes out of bounds rarely. So there are not so many people in the world who have an out of bounds Jupiter. And I will mention some examples in the end. And I think I'm going to show you how rarely Jupiter becomes out of bounds as well. Uranus and Pluto go out of bounds for lengthy periods. So there are whole decades when some people are born with out of bounds Uranus and Pluto. So that's more of a generational thing. And they're most interesting in the mundane astrology. Although if some person has an out of bound Pluto, let's say, in parallel with his or her moon, that might be important. Just maybe this person is in the contact of those changes in the society manifested by the out of bounds higher planets, which is also a topic I'm going to cover. And Saturn and Neptune, as you remember, never go out of bounds. So out of bounds moon. This is a topic very thoroughly covered by Katie Boehre in her book. She did a lot of research with thousands of people. And perhaps, and Steve Forrest also writes that the out of bounds moon is perhaps the most important of OOB planets. It shows a person who is in one or another way unique, unlike everyone else, and has an unusual destiny. And what I've noticed as well, if there is other out of bounds planets in the natal chart, it usually manifests itself more prominently when the natal moon is out of bounds as well. So it like amplifies the out of bound manifestations of the other planets as well. So according to Katie, she has she has written quite a lot of examples, ideas about out-of-bounds moon. But the gist of what she's writing about is that very often people who were born with out-of-bounds moon were deprived of motherly love in their childhoods, or on one or another reason. And later in their adult lives, they strive to compensate for this lack of love by achieving success, recognition, and wealth. This is why Katie calls such people the millionaires of the zodiac. And the examples of people with the out-of-bounds moon are Camilla Parker Bowles, Amelia Earhart, Albert Einstein, Sigmund Freud, Queen Victoria, Keanu Reeves, Arnold Schwarzenegger, Warren Buffett, Oprah Winfrey. Yeah, each of them is interesting and unusual in their own way. Out-of-bounds Mercury. Well, just from the symbolism of Mercury, we could say that it means thinking out of the box. And therefore, such a person can find unusual solutions for all sorts of problems, including those related to communication, transportation, commerce, and other areas of life associated with Mercury. And sometimes this symbolism or this guess of what an OB Mercury would mean just hits the eye of the bull, so say with Elon Musk, for example, because Elon Musk is a perfect example of an out-of-bounds Mercury. Another interesting example is Donald Trump, I would say, because it's a US president who uses Twitter as his main tool of communication with the world. Again, it's out-of-bounds Mercury. But there are other cases where Mercury is out of bounds, but we can't see how clearly it manifests, at least because with famous people, we don't know them clearly very well, who they are as a person, unless you study their biography thoroughly, for which not everyone has time. But also there are other people with out of bounds Mercury, like Bob Dylan, Tom Hanks, Henri Matisse, Elvis Presley, Maximilian Robespierre, Donald Trump, and Marlene Dietrich. Louis Pasteur has 4 out-of-bounds planets: the Moon, Mercury, Venus, and Uranus. Kirk Douglas, who had a very, very long creative life, has Mercury and the Moon out of bounds in a precise parallel with each other. Maybe Mercury gives this youth or additional, I don't know, makes a person younger physically, because physiologically, maybe just a guess. And he has also an out-of-bounds Mars. Brad Pitt has an out-of-bounds Mercury and Mars in a precise parallel. Just some findings. Not always I can symbolically interpret this, how this manifests in their lives, but maybe you'll find some interesting facts. Out-of-bounds Venus. Well, to theoretically guess what it should mean or what it should show, the person is unlike everyone else in the realm of beauty, art, taste, attractiveness, love. What I found very interesting is that those men who women find especially attractive often have an out-of-bounds Venus. Men have an out-of-bounds Venus, and it makes them popular with women. Look, David Beckham, Frank Sinatra, Clint Eastwood, Omar Sharif, Al Pacino, Charlie Chaplin, Rodolfo Valentino. Interesting. But there are also quite a few painters, sculptors, musicians with out-of-bounds Venus, which is logical, which is as we would expect it to be. Auguste Rodin, Albrecht Dürer, Yehudi Menuhin, Johannes Brahms. Winston Churchill, how did out-of-bounds Venus manifest in his example? I don't know. Cher, the goddess of pop, logical. Brooke Shields, this is the case when both the Moon and Venus are out of bounds, which makes the manifestations of out-of-bounds Venus more prominent. And Brooke Shields became a child model aged 10, Venus. with out of bounds Venus, with out of bounds Moon. Catherine the Great, interestingly, also had Venus and the Moon out of bounds, and she was a patron of arts, Venus, and famous for having many lovers. Out of bounds Mars, how would we theoretically define it? An unusual approach or ability when it comes to spending energy, perhaps. It can make a person unusually brave or sexually gifted or having an undefeatable fighting spirit. In major astrology, out of bounds Mars is called a super sports champion factor. So it gives some unusual physical abilities and can be found in charts of some sportsmen, successful sportsmen. But what I found is that out of bound Mars can be seen in the charts of Amal Clooney, Prince Charles, or Charles III, sorry, not everything was updated properly. Prince Harry, Meghan Markle, Walt Disney, Julia Roberts, quite a few. Actually, out of bounds Mars is the most frequently found out of bounds planets. It spends more time than any other planet out of bounds. Greta Garbo, Lady Gaga, Martin Luther King, Pablo Picasso, Agatha Christie. Interestingly, Rupert Murdoch, just an interesting example, out of bounds Mars and the Moon is as far out of bounds as it can be, 28 degrees, 15 minutes. And Larry King was born with out of bounds Moon, Venus, and Mars. Out of bounds Jupiter might theoretically mean an unusual worldview or philosophy. And it was very difficult to find any examples. As I mentioned, Jupiter becomes out of bounds quite rarely. And but one example I found first, the example I found first is Prince Harry. And this is interesting because his out of bounds Jupiter might help us to explain why he found to separate from the royal family, because Jupiter is like a symbol of nobility and royalty maybe, and he chose a different life. Karl Pribram, the author of holonomic model of consciousness, basically, who says that our world is a hologram. So a very unusual and interesting worldview. Enrico Fermi, the architect of the nuclear age, also a very unusual thinker with an unusual worldview, I believe, although I don't know too much about him. A few curious examples. It seems to be typical for Russian leaders to have an out-of-bounds planet. Mikhail Gorbachev has an out-of-bounds Mars, Boris Yeltsin had an out-of-bounds Moon, and Vladimir Putin has both the Moon and the Mars out of bounds. But I suspect that the official date of birth for him is not correct. I won't explain it right here, but I think that in reality he was born a couple of years earlier, and I have some reasons for that, but that's not within the discussion of this workshop. On the other hand, you see, most Russian leaders had something out of bounds. But in the world, if you're looking for out of bounds planets within people who achieved some success as a country leader or a high-level political figure, you won't find many. I could only find Donald Trump. He's different. But most other people are normally within the bounds who are in politics or in high-level business and so on. In synastry, it's very interesting. Imagine when two people meet each other on a crowded street in the city. They might not notice each other, right? So there should be other factors that attract their attention to each other. But if two people meet each other in an empty forest or in a field, they will notice each other from far. They will clearly notice each other and recognize the presence of each other. And therefore, I believe that if two people have an aspect of declination, of course, between the out of bounds planets, that's a very, very prominent and strong factor for their relationship. They might notice each other from far. And even the orb in this case is not that important. If they have two out of bounds planets, like Venus and Mars, we can even increase the orb a little bit to allow that aspect to exist. An example I found, it's David Beckham's Venus has a declination of 25 degrees 16 minutes, while the declination of Victoria Beckham's Mars is 24 degrees 58 minutes, well within the parallel. So his Venus and her Mars are both out of bounds and in parallel. And I think this is a major factor, bringing them together, keeping them together in their relationship. The next interesting idea is that, okay, a person can be born with an out-of-bound planet or two or three or four, but some people are not born with out-of-bounds planets. But we can use secondary progression to see if any planets became out of bounds later in life, in secondary progression, the moon or something else. And maybe some planets cease to be out of bounds after some time in their life. And usually when a planet which wasn't out of bounds becomes out of bounds, something important happens in the person's life. And vice versa, when a planet which was out of bounds and became in bounds, like normal, something important might happen. And one example, you can check, I created an online calculator. Oh, the link should be corrected. It's not lunarium.co, but lunarium.co.uk. I had a lot of mess with those domain names and lost quite a lot of visitors as a result. But yeah, this is the link with the correction of co.uk to the online calculator, freely available to everyone. And you can go and check. It will show you your out of bounds planets and also whether something is changing. Oh, thank you very much, Chris. Whether they're changing in the out of bounds status is changing over time within life. And this is, I haven't put in, I thought I have a screenshot for that, but no. But you will see, it's easy. Just enter the date, the time, probably built, I don't remember, and press the button, and it's very easy to use. What I notice, one of my observations, is that when my Mercury was in bounds when I was born, but it became out of bounds when I was aged 43. And what happened then? I left the country I lived in, went to Scotland, became a student of a Scottish university, a student, Mercury, right, out of bounds, because that was crazily unusual in any country, I believe, but especially in the country I lived in, to do something like that, out of bounds, and it's still out of bounds, happily. So this is another idea to explore. And well, out of bounds planets in transit, you can, if you use the ephemeris, you can easily see on my webpage that sometimes planets become out of bounds in planets in transit. Current planets may be out of bounds. And I was thinking, what would they symbolize? Because this out of bounds status of transiting planets wasn't studied enough. People studied out of bounds Mars, yes, because we'll speak about it a little bit later, but out of bounds Mercury, out of bounds Venus, they're also very interesting. Out of bounds Moon. I believe they're somewhat similar to retrograde periods. For example, the period of out of bounds Mercury should be similar to the period of retrograde Mercury. Why? Because I believe, in my view, the period of retrograde Mercury is when we lose the stereotype of Mercury. And when the Mercury is retrograde, like right now, we are looking for a new stereotype. That's why we are open to all sorts of unusual ideas, which we wouldn't consider when we are between the periods of retrograde Mercury. So it's out of stereotypes, so to say, and it's open to new things, but also it's not very reliable. We wouldn't recommend to sign important agreements when Mercury is retrograde, because some time will pass and we'll have a new stereotype and we'll change our mind. I think something similar should be said about an out of bounds Mercury. It's in the forest, it does things which are not usually done in the city. So it might be not reliable to do things when Mercury out of bounds. Especially interesting is out of bounds Mars, and it's usually paid a lot of attention by some astrologers, at least. It often coincides with uncontrolled outbursts of energy, both in nature and society. Like there can be abnormal destructive weather conditions, natural disasters, incidents, and violence. The periods of out of bounds Mars are not that rare. They happen every year, usually twice a year. But they may be very short, like we had in February an out of bounds Mars period, January, February, I think, which was less than a month. But sometimes when out of bounds status of Mars overlaps with its retrograde motion, with the retrograde motion of Mars, those periods can exceed half a year. And when such lengthy periods happen, quite rarely, often something abnormal happens. For example, in 1986, there were 194 days of out of bounds Mars, from 27th of March to the 7th of October. And that was the time of Chernobyl. Actually, when Chernobyl happened, on that day, Mars was out of bounds and the moon was coming to out of bounds status on that very day. And they say that when the moon supports like some out of bounds planets, that's the more critical time than the usual like out of bounds Mars. The next out of bounds, lengthy out of bounds period was in 2001, and it was 188 days long. And it was the year of 9/11. And the next such a period was in 2007, 2008, 203 days. And that was the time of a global financial crisis. And what's interesting, another such period is coming very soon. It will start on the 23rd of October this year and will continue until the 5th of May, 2023. And it will be 194 days long. And here's another link to my website. Again, CO instead of co.uk. It should be co.uk. And there is an article, I think it lists all the various periods of extreme Mars, including out of bounds Mars and closing, thank you very much, and closing and crossing the equator, which is also considered to be a difficult and risky time. If we have a look at out of bounds Pluto, then it's also, it never goes, or at least in our century, in the previous century, it doesn't go out of bounds for the whole year, but there are periods when it becomes out of bounds, returns into bounds, and there is a lengthy period when it does that. And the latest such period was from the 17th of February, 1938 to the 20th of May, 1953. 38, 53. You see, what do you think about that period of time? It was the rise of totalitarian regimes in many countries, Pluto, right? And the culmination, I mean that those periods of out of bounds Pluto were becoming longer, and then at some point they started to become shorter, and that turn of tide was in 1944 and 1945. And then the course of the World War II was reversed, basically. You see, interesting correlation. And that was also the time of major advancements in nuclear research and in creation of nuclear weapons, right? Those years from 1938 to 1953. The previous period of out of bounds Pluto in transit was from 1774 to 1795. And that was the period of the American Revolutionary War and French Revolution. And interestingly, I found in Wikipedia that a part of that, years from 1793 to 1794, were called by historians the Reign of Terror. It was a series of massacres and numerous public executions, which reminds me of the period from 1938 to 1953. And again, I have some worrying news for you, perhaps, that the next such period of out of bounds Pluto is coming, not in some foreseeable future. It will start on the 30th of August 2025 and will continue until the 16th of November 2035. So what it is going to bring us, we can only guess. Out of bounds Uranus in transit is also quite interesting because it seems to mark revolutionary changes in the world. There was a period from 1903 to 1907, and in the very middle of that period was 1905, the year of the first Russian Revolution. Interestingly, in the same year, Einstein published his relativity theory, 1905, in the middle of out of bounds Uranus. Also, that was the beginning of the pioneer era in aviation, when a lot of important developments happened in the world of aviation. The next period of out of bounds Uranus was from 1947 to 1952, and it overlapped with out of bounds Pluto period. Interestingly, that was the time of creation of nuclear weapons and the means of their delivery, missiles, air bombs. And the two main materials from which nuclear bombs are made is uranium for Uranus and plutonium for Pluto. Quite an interesting fact. And then there was a period from 1987 to 1991 when personal computers became a reality, and the internet, another revolutionary change. And then again, there will be a period overlapping with OB Pluto. Perhaps again, there will be something powerful and frightening created then, 2031, 2035. And this is, I just spent some time with the ephemeris to write down the periods when different planets became in bounds, out of bounds from the, for example, in the 20th century. You see, for example, Jupiter, it became out of bounds on the, it's in European standard format. Americans might be not comfortable with it, but that's what I use. So it became out of bounds on the 13th of August, 1901, and returned back to the areas of the sun on the 18th of October, 1901. So just for a few months. And the next time it became out of bounds was in 1907 only. And the next time it was in 1919. So it becomes out of bounds not so often and only for a few months. So it is quite rare, and it can be an important and interesting factor in natal charts. Then there was a period of retrograde Uranus and Pluto. You see how it becomes and stops to be out of bounds. First in 1938, it became out of bounds on the 17th of February and returned back on the 3rd of June. But then these periods were becoming longer and longer. 26th of January, 28th of June, 11th of January, 14th of July, and so on. And through the end of the Uranus, Pluto. So you will probably have these slides, and you can see all the other periods. I won't go through them. Oops. So now I've finished with the presentation. There are a few other things I can tell you and show you. But questions, please, for now.
Well, thank you very much, Alexander. That was absolutely fantastic and really clearly explained. I think that period, 1987 to 1991, with Uranus out of bounds, was also pretty revolutionary in Europe, because of course it started with perestroika and glasnost around.
Oh, yes, of course.
And then finishing with the breakup of the Soviet Union in 91 and Berlin Wall and everything else. So 89 felt like a very revolutionary year to me. I was going through my Saturn return at the time, and the whole of Europe was just falling to pieces. And it certainly felt very revolutionary.
Yeah, I forgot that actually. Thank you very much, Chris.
Does anybody else have any questions for Alexander at this stage?
If no questions, then I can tell you that story, which was a little bit out of bounds, but I was born with out of bounds Mars. And my Mars is in Cancer in the 9th house. And it manifested itself in a number of strange ways. For example, Mars and Cancer and the 9th house, it could be some signs, right? It could be, which signs could that be? Can you guess? I wonder if you looked into synastry in progressed declination when relationship. Yes, there is actually a whole method which looks into the progressions of in declinations and makes some conclusions on them. I just didn't include it in this presentation. I thought I've had a book just published a month ago, maybe less than a month ago. It's on declination and the aspects of declination and out of bounds planets, a whole book, but it's in Russian. I don't have any publishing in the West, and self-publishing is a difficult and not very interesting path, I think. Maybe I'm wrong. So, do the personal planets move faster out of bounds and inbound? The fastest is the moon, of course. The moon, but the moon has a very interesting feature. What happens of the so whether the moon will become out of bounds in a particular year depends on where the lunar nodes are. Of the so you know that the cycle of lunar nodes is about 19 years, and of that 19 years, for about 9 years, the moon never becomes out of bounds. For 9 years, it never becomes out of bounds. And for 10 years, it becomes out of bounds every month. I have an illustration for that, but again, I didn't include it into this presentation. I didn't think there will be time for it, but look at this. When the north lunar node coincides with the vernal equinox, what happens then? We call the north node because in this node the moon goes north, right, towards the north, and vernal equinox is where the sun goes towards north. And so the difference between the orbs of the sun and the moon is added the declination of the sun. So the moon becomes out of bound. When the north node of the moon is close to the vernal equinox, the moon does become out of bound every month. But then there are whole periods of several years when the north node is close to the autumnal equinox, if I pronounce that properly, to 0 Libra, basically. And in that case, the moon goes below the maximum declination of the sun, and for the whole range of years, it never becomes out of bounds. So that's for the moon. For the other planets, their ability to be out of bounds might change depending on when the planetary nodes move, how they move, but they move very, very slowly. So other questions, please. And yes,
let people unmute themselves. So if you have a question, just unmute yourself and feel free to ask.
I just wanted to ask, I was looking at a few charts and noticed it's not that common to have out of bounds, especially with numerous planets. And so that's really fascinating to hear the talk and how that would manifest for the individual. But one chart I looked at had an out of bounds moon, which made sense with the lack of mother love. The sun is almost exactly at its maximum, 23 degrees, 23 minutes, not quite 26 minutes. But I wondered, that looks like a very powerful place for the sun to be almost at its boundary.
That is, yes. And actually there are, in the declination cycle of a planet, there are a few different like critical points when the symbolism of this planet becomes more prominent and shows itself in nature more brightly. And the declination of the sun, or being close to it, is one of those critical points. So you're speaking about the moon, then the symbolism of the moon might be more prominent or more important in the life of the person if its declination coincides or very close to the declination of the sun. So it can be, depending on in which house, in which aspects, you know, we just put more attention to it. It's somehow more prominent, can be.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I think the moon was quite out of bounds, but the sun was near its limit, very close to Mars.
You mean the sun? The moon is out of bounds, but the sun is near its limit.
Yeah.
Well, the sun, well, it reaches its limits pretty much regularly near the solstices. So it's not, I think it's not something unusual. It's everyone who has her sun in the end of Gemini or in the beginning of Cancer will have it close to that limit, or in the end of Sagittarius or in the beginning of Capricorn. They all have the sun close to the limit.
Oh yeah, of course. Okay, thank you.
Gemini was asking whether this is about geocentric planetary nodes. Do you want to?
Yeah, I was speaking everything about geocentric things here, yes. Heliocentric will be the topic of my next talk in a couple of days. On the 25th, we're speaking about geocentric here, yes.
Yeah, so it's, first of all, brilliant presentation. Thank you so much. It's really nice to be in your work, and this is one of these talks that will change my astrology, so thank you. I'm wondering, it just seems like kind of tricky math, given that the geocentric nodes of the planets move based upon Earth's position of observation, right? So finding these times where planets peak out of bounds. Like I was a little bit surprised even about Pluto, because I know Pluto's nodes are in the solstice, and therefore the bendings are near the equinox points where we have minimum declination, right? So to see that Pluto could get that far out of bounds, for example, is that something that's just happening historically, or?
But Pluto, the thing is that Pluto can have quite significant ecliptic latitude. So it's the furthest planet that goes from the path of the sun. And that's also a factor to influence how far it can go in declination.
Right, but does those in the equinox signs, right? Because the nodes are in Cancer and Capricorn, so the bendings
So
are in Libra and Aries.
in Pluto's case, you can see if you see how far Pluto goes out of bound, then in the 17th century or 18th century, it went out of bound quite more significantly than. So I didn't look at where the Pluto's planetary nodes were then, but maybe you can have a look. And in the previous ages, like in the 17th century, I believe.
Well, cool. Yeah, so it's like a historic period. So Pluto's out of bounds. Interesting.
Yeah.
I have another question. I'm wondering if you can answer, Alexander. I was surprised to find that like the maximum out of bounds moons in the coming standstill were not when the node was exactly at 0 degrees tropical Aries, but rather close by. And I couldn't explain astronomically why it wouldn't be at the times when the moon is at the solstice points and the north node is exactly at the vernal point.
I don't know. I didn't think about that, to be honest.
All right, thanks.
But I would recommend, if you can get it, it's difficult to get, but the spring 1998 Geocosmic Journal, how it is called, the magazine of NCGR is full of information about declination, out of bounds, and it's very, very valuable, but it's very hard to get. I was only able to find it in the private library in Wales. I forgot the name of the person who owns it. Philip Graves. Yeah, Philip Graves got a private library in Wales, and I went there especially to work on this topic, and only he could provide for me this NCGR magazine, or Geocosmic magazine, 1998. So that's one of the sources of my information.
Gaurav had a question. He said that he's missed a lot of the talk because he had a please tell me what degrees of declination we consider for a planet to be giving extreme results, although not being out of bound.
Well, it's first, it's when the planet crosses the celestial equator, so its declination is close to 0, and also when it crosses the maximum declination of the sun, so that's like a sensitive line, 23 degrees 26 minutes. But also when the planet is turning retro, and when it is out of bounds, of course, it is important. But for example, when an out of bounds period of Mars starts, for example, it will start, I don't remember the exact date. It will start in October. Okay. The next period of out of bounds Mars will start on the 23rd of October, and they say that's the most like critical time, because the Mars will be then crossing the maximum declination of the sun, and that's when it usually manifests itself quite critically, and then in the end, in the beginning of May 2023. And
Gemini's asking whether Autoprocessor's use works for Mac OS.
Yeah, that's an important feature, because what happened, my main computer is Mac currently, and for a long time I had a very narrow range of software packages I could use. Solify is Windows only. Well, they created Astro Gold, which is for Mac, but it's limited in its features. And Astro Processor Zeus has exactly same functionality for both Mac OS and Windows. And I work with it on the Mac, but now I have problem with my main computer, and I'm working with it on Windows, and it's exactly the same software, which is beautiful and quite reliable and regularly upgraded. So I like it. Actually, while I'm still looking for questions, I might try to show you Astro Processor Zeus running, if you wish.
Yeah, we've got 5 minutes. We've got 4 minutes, so that.
Just a brief look at it. Here it is. Okay, do you see it?
Yes.
So I need to move these windows. Okay, so here is Astro Processor Zeus, and what I like about it, the chart. Let's see the chart of Keanu Reeves, and what I like about it is that you can hover your mouse over an aspect, and you see contraparallel of latitude, because this is, and I created different perspectives for different purposes. For example, I worked with heliocentric astrology here for my next presentation on Sunday, and I set up a perspective for working with heliocentric astrology. So this is a heliocentric chart of Keanu Reeves, but I can switch easily to geocentric perspective because I created a special. Here it is. This is a normal geocentric chart, and again, now if we hold the mouse a little bit, parallel of declination, Jupiter, Pluto, and 46 minutes, and becoming more precise, applying. So, and you can see this kind of information about every aspect you can find in the chat. And analysis, we can go to analysis and declination scale. Do you see the declination scale?
Yeah.
So you see it's quite convenient. Also, we can go to analysis and graphic ephemeris. And here's the graphic ephemeris. And we need to like dynamic. Let's leave the moon only. Oh, the moon. I can change the color of the moon, but that takes a little bit of time. Customizing colors. Let's make the moon some bright line. No, it wasn't customized on some reason. Perhaps I should press OK here. Yes. So this is the line of the moon. Okay. A failed presentation, but okay. This it takes a few minutes to fine-tune this graphic ephemeris, but what I like about them is that you can see those hairlines. They show you exactly the date where you are in, and line thickness. Okay, something is coming here, and then we switch to transit or secondary progression. We can use progression and in declination. And use the chart for like 24. See, or here's something coming already. You see a graph of the secondary progressed moon, and those bright lines is where it crosses the 23 degrees 26 minutes, and you can see exactly where we are by looking at the cursor, the hairlines. So something like that, and you can create it for the whole life if you wish. 72 years maybe. Yeah, this is something similar. And yeah, we can change the color of this line, just I'm a little bit clumsy right now. So this is it. I think we came to the end of the presentation.
Well, that was absolutely brilliant. Thank you very much indeed, Alexander. There's lots of very positive comments in the chat. And thank you for a wonderful workshop, which I think, as several people have said, will change our astrology. So thank you
very much. Thank you.
Indeed.